The auditorium was packed. Bright stage lights illuminated the sleek, modern set, casting sharp shadows behind the two figures seated at the center. The air buzzed with anticipation. Cameras rolled, broadcasting the event live to millions. This wasn't just another interview. This was a showdown. At one side of the table sat Barron Trump, calm, collected, unreadable. Dressed in a crisp, dark suit, he exuded quiet confidence, but his posture was relaxed, his expression neutral. He knew exactly what was coming. Opposite him was Ethan Cole, a veteran journalist with a reputation for being ruthless. His sharp, scrutinizing gaze locked onto Barron, like a predator sizing up its prey. He had taken down politicians, CEOs, and celebrities, exposing their flaws with piercing questions. And now he had his sights set on the youngest Trump. Cole leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. People say you've had everything handed to you since birth, that you've never struggled a day in your life. So tell me, Barron, what do you say to those who think you've had it easy? The room tensed. A hush fell over the audience. Even those watching at home could feel it. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Barron took a slow breath, exhaling evenly. He didn't blink. He didn't shift in his seat. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, controlled. That's an interesting assumption. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. Cole raised an eyebrow, intrigued. He had expected defensiveness, maybe even anger. Instead, Barron was unfazed. "Let me ask you something," Barron continued, his gaze unwavering. "What does it really mean to have an easy life?" Cole smirked, sensing an opportunity to press harder. "It means you've never had to fight for anything. Never known hunger. Never felt the fear of losing everything. You were born into power and privilege. That's not a struggle, is it?" Barron nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the point. Then, with the precision of a seasoned debater, he responded, "You're right. I've never wondered where my next meal was coming from. I've never had to sleep on the streets. But tell me, does struggle only come in one form?" The room was dead silent. Even Cole hesitated. Barron leaned forward slightly. "Because if you think wealth means never struggling, that maybe you don't understand struggle at all." Boom. The tension thickened. The audience was hooked. Some nodded in agreement. Others whispered, analyzing his words in real time. This wasn't just another interview. This was a battle of perspectives, and it was only getting started. Ethan Cole smirked, leaning back slightly in his chair. He wasn't going to let Barron take control of the conversation. Not yet. "You're dodging the question," Cole said, his voice smooth but laced with challenge. "You say struggle comes in different forms. Fine. Then tell me, what have you struggled with?" Barron's expression didn't waver. He rested his hands on the table, fingers lightly interlaced. "I grew up in a world where my last name was my identity before I even had a chance to create one for myself. Everything I do, everything I say, is judged before it even leaves my mouth. People expect me to fail. They want me to fail." Cole's eyes flickered with interest. "So, you're saying your struggle is expectations?" Barron exhaled through his nose, a hint of amusement in his eyes. Expectations. Assumptions. Being treated as a symbol instead of a person. I could say something profound, and it would be dismissed as scripted. I could make a mistake, and it would be magnified 1,000 times over. Tell me, Ethan, how many people in this room had to prove they weren't a mistake before they even became adults? The audience murmured. Cole hesitated for half a second, just enough for Barron to notice. "You think struggle is only about having nothing," Barron continued. "Try living in a world where everything you do is weighed against the actions of people you've never even met, where your successes aren't your own, but your failures. Those belong to you entirely." Cole straightened in his chair. He had underestimated him. Barron Trump wasn't just here to defend himself. He was here to make a point. Do you think expectations can be a form of struggle? Have you ever been judged before people even got to know you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Ethan Cole crossed his arms, letting a moment of silence stretch between them. He wasn't used to losing control of an interview, but Barron had flipped the dynamic in an instant. The tension in the room was thick. "You make an interesting argument," Cole said, tapping his pen against the desk. "But let's be honest, there are millions of people struggling to put food on the table, to keep a roof over their heads. Do you really expect them to sympathize with the burden of being a Trump?" Barron nodded slightly, unfazed. "I don't expect sympathy. I expect perspective." Cole arched a brow. "Perspective?" Barron leaned forward. "You assume struggle is a competition. That because someone has it worse, my experience doesn't count. But that's not how struggle works. It's not about measuring who suffers more. It's about understanding that pain exists in different forms." The audience murmured again. Some nodded in agreement. Others weren't sure what to think. "Let me ask you something, Ethan," Barron continued, locking eyes with the journalist. "If a man is drowning in 10 feet of water and another is drowning in 20 feet, does it matter who's deeper, or do they both need saving?" Cole hesitated, just for a second. But Barron saw it. "Pain isn't a contest," Barron added, his voice steady. "We don't have to tear each other down to validate our own struggles. We all deserve to be heard." For the first time in the interview, Cole had no immediate comeback. The power had shifted. For a moment, the tension in the room settled into an uneasy quiet. The audience wasn't just watching an interview anymore. They were witnessing a shift, a battle of perspectives, where neither side was willing to back down. Ethan Cole knew he had to regain control. He adjusted his posture, leaning forward. "All right, Barron. Let's say I agree that struggle isn't a competition. That doesn't change the fact that the world sees you as privileged. And privilege gives you advantages. Whether you acknowledge it or not, doesn't that put you ahead of everyone else?" Barron tilted his head slightly, considering the question. Privilege isn't a free pass. It's a tool. And like any tool, it depends on how you use it. Some use it to build, others let it rot. Cole wasn't satisfied. That's easy to say when you've never had to start from nothing. Barron's expression darkened for the first time. He let out a slow breath before speaking. "Do you think being born into wealth makes you immune to pain? That having money means you never feel lost? I've met people with nothing who are more free than billionaires trapped in their own expectations." The words hung in the air. Some in the audience whispered to one another. Cole saw an opening and pushed further. "So what are you saying? That you struggle just like everyone else?" Barron shook his head. "No. I'm saying struggle is universal, but privilege shapes how we experience it. The real question isn't who has it worse. The real question it is, what do you do with what you've been given?" Cole let the silence linger. He wasn't sure how to counter that, because it wasn't just an answer. It was a challenge. A slow clap came from somewhere in the audience. Then another. Within seconds, a ripple of applause filled the room. Cole exhaled, glancing at Barron, who remained calm, collected, but unmistakably in control. "What do you think? Is privilege an advantage or just another challenge? Share your thoughts in the comments." Ethan Cole let the applause fade before leaning back in his chair, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. The rhythm was calculated. He was thinking, recalibrating. He wasn't about to let this slip away. "All right, Barron," he said, his voice slower now, more deliberate. "You've made your point about struggle. But let's talk about responsibility. With privilege comes power, and with power comes responsibility. Do you believe you have an obligation to use what you've been given to help those who weren't as lucky?" Barron took a moment before answering, his expression unreadable. "That's a question that always comes up, isn't it? He exhaled slightly. People assume that privilege means you owe the world something. But let me ask you this, Ethan. If you weren't sitting in this chair, if you didn't have this platform, would anyone expect you to save them? Cole arched a brow, intrigued by the counter. Are you saying you don't have a responsibility to help others? Barron shook his head. I'm saying responsibility isn't exclusive to the privileged. We all have the ability to lift someone up. A rich man giving money to charity isn't any more noble than a struggling single mother who helps her neighbor. The difference is perception. The audience murmured. Some nodded in agreement, others weren't so sure. Cole pressed on. But isn't it easier for someone in your position to make a difference? Shouldn't those who have more do more? Barron leaned forward slightly. Easier, sure. But just because something is easier doesn't mean it's more meaningful. What really matters is intent. I could donate $1 million tomorrow, and people would say, he's just doing it for PR. If I do nothing, they say, he doesn't care. No matter what I do, the narrative is already written before I act. Cole nodded, his lips pressed together. He could see where this was going. So what's the answer then? What should someone in your position do? Barron's expression didn't change. They should do what feels right. Not because the world demands it, but because it matters to them. The moment you do something just to please others, you've already lost. Silence stretched between them. The tension wasn't hostile. It was charged, filled with something real, something raw. The audience could feel it. Then, from the back of the room, someone clapped. A slow, deliberate clap that spread through the auditorium like a wave. It wasn't just applause. It was acknowledgement. Cole sighed, shaking his head with a small smirk. You're good. I'll give you that. Barron simply smiled, his eyes steady, unwavering. Ethan Cole glanced down at his notes, tapping his pen against the edge of the table. He had thrown everything he had at Barron Trump. But the young man had met every question with an answer that turned the conversation in his favor. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't deflection. It was control, calm, measured, undeniable control. Cole inhaled sharply and leaned in, lowering his voice just slightly, as if the next question held more weight than any before it. All right, Barron. Here's the real question. What do you want people to remember you for? What's the legacy you're trying to build? The audience went still. It was the kind of question that could define an entire conversation, the kind that forced a person to reveal who they truly were beneath all the words, all the debates, all the well-crafted responses. Barron didn't rush to answer. He let the silence stretch, as if he was carefully weighing his thoughts. Then he folded his hands on the table and met Cole's gaze without hesitation. I want to be remembered as someone who made people think for themselves. Cole narrowed his eyes. That's it. Not wealth, not power, not the Trump name. Barron shook his head. Those things fade. Influence shifts. Names get forgotten. But ideas last. If I can challenge people to see the world differently, to question what they believe instead of just accepting what they're told, then I'd done something real. The murmur in the audience grew louder. People were leaning forward in their seats. Some nodded in agreement. Others whispered to their neighbors, debating what they had just heard. Cole could feel the shift in the room, the way the atmosphere had become something electric, something alive. He exhaled through his nose and sat back. Well, I'll give you this. Most people in your position wouldn't have answered like that. Barron offered a small smile. That's kind of the point, isn't it? A chuckle rippled through the audience. Cole smirked, shaking his head. All right, I think that's where we'll leave it. The moment held, stretching into something unspoken but powerful. Then, just as Cole opened his mouth to formally wrap things up, a voice from the audience called out. What would your father say about all this? The energy in the room changed instantly. Some gasped. Others turned to see who had spoken. Cole glanced at Barron. waiting to see how he'd react. Barron Trump just smiled. What do you think makes a legacy truly meaningful? Power, wealth, or the impact on people's minds? Let us know in the comments. The tension in the auditorium was almost tangible. The unexpected question from the audience had thrown a new energy into the air, shifting the tone from a structured interview to something more personal, more unpredictable. Barron Trump didn't flinch. He let the weight of the moment settle before responding, his expression unreadable. That's a question a lot of people want to ask, isn't it? He said, his voice steady, neither defensive nor dismissive. He leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. What would my father say about all this? The audience held their breath. Even Ethan Cole, who had prided himself on maintaining control throughout the interview, found himself genuinely curious. He could press, dig deeper, but something told him to wait. Barron exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. I think my father, like any parent, wants to see his children succeed. But success means different things to different people. To some, it's power. To others, it's influence. To me, success is having control over your own narrative. A murmur rippled through the audience. It wasn't the answer they expected, but it was one that carried weight. Cole took the opportunity to step in. So you're saying your definition of success is different from his? Barron's lips curled into a small smile. Isn't that what every generation wants? To carve out their own path. The room was silent again, but this time, it wasn't because of tension. It was because of understanding. Cole tilted his head. So let me ask you this. What's next? If you want control over your own narrative, where does that road lead? Barron glanced down for a moment, considering. Then he looked up, his gaze sharper, more certain than before. I don't have that answered yet. And that's the beauty of it. For once, I get to decide for myself. The audience erupted in applause. It wasn't just appreciation, it was respect. Whether they agreed with him or not, they recognized that Barron Trump wasn't just another last name. He was something else entirely. The applause faded, but the energy in the room lingered, electric and charged with an unspoken understanding. For the first time, the conversation was no longer about expectation or legacy. It was about something deeper. Barron Trump was no longer just answering questions. He was defining himself in real time. Ethan Cole, sensing this shift, leaned forward again, his voice measured. You say you get to decide your own path. That's a powerful statement. But what does that look like? What do you do with that kind of freedom? Barron took a slow breath, considering the weight of the question. I think that's something people misunderstand about freedom, he said. It's not about doing whatever you want. It's about knowing what matters and having the power to pursue it. Cole nodded, intrigued. And what matters to you? Barron hesitated, but only for a second. Truth. The room fell silent again, waiting for him to elaborate. He continued, his voice steady. People want to put you in a box, tell you who you are before you even figure it out yourself. I've seen it happen my whole life. But the truth is, no one's story is written for them. You have to take the pen. Cole crossed his arms, his expression thoughtful. And what about the people who say you'll never be more than your last name? That no matter what you do, you'll always be defined by it. Barron's eyes darkened slightly. But there was no anger, only certainty. They're entitled to their opinion. But their words don't decide my future. I do. The statement hit like a thunderclap. The audience murmured, some nodding in agreement, others shifting in their seats. Cole, for once, had no immediate counter. Instead, he let the silence do the work. After a pause, he spoke again, softer this time. So what now? What's next for Barron Trump? Barron exhaled, a small, almost amused smile forming. Whatever I choose. The audience erupted into another wave of applause. Cole sat back, watching the young man in front of him, perhaps realizing that this wasn't the interview he had expected. It was something much bigger. The applause slowly faded, but the energy in the room remained electrified. The conversation had shifted from interrogation to revelation, from expected answers to something far deeper. The audience wasn't just watching an interview anymore. They were witnessing a defining moment. Ethan Cole adjusted his posture, exhaling as he studied Barron. He had interviewed presidents, billionaires, and world leaders, but this was different. There was no political agenda here, no scripted responses. Barron Trump wasn't trying to win anyone over. He was just speaking his truth. Cole leaned in one last time. "All right, Barron. One final question." Barron nodded, his expression unreadable, waiting. "If you had the chance to say one thing, just one, to the people who doubt you, who judge you before they know you, what would it be?" A hush fell over the auditorium. The weight of the question pressed down on the space between them. Even those who had tuned in out of skepticism, out of curiosity, held their breath. Barron took a slow, deliberate breath before answering. "I'd tell them that their judgment doesn't define me, and it shouldn't define them, either." Cole's eyes flickered, as if the response had caught him off guard. "Explain." Barron continued, his voice steady. "We live in a world where people love to put labels on each other. Rich, poor, privileged, unworthy. But the truth is, no label can tell you who a person really is. The only thing that defines you is what you choose to do every single day. And that choice, that belongs to you." For the first time, Ethan Cole didn't speak. He simply nodded, as if realizing that nothing more needed to be said. A slow clap began, then another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet. The interview was over, but its impact would last far beyond that moment. Barron Trump didn't just answer the questions. He changed the conversation. "Do you believe people should be judged by their background or by their choices? Let us know in the comments." The auditorium emptied slowly, but the conversation wasn't over. Outside, journalists gathered like a storm, cameras flashing, microphones reaching. The air buzzed with urgency. Everyone wanted a reaction, a soundbite, a headline. Barron Trump stepped into the cold night air, his breath visible in the dim glow of streetlights. His phone vibrated. Messages poured in, some praising his words, others twisting them. He expected that. He had lived with it his whole life. Ethan Cole emerged from the building, watching him from a distance. Something about the interview had shifted his perspective. He wasn't sure if he had won or lost the exchange. But one thing was clear: Barron wasn't the person the world had assumed him to be. Cole approached, hands in his pockets. "Not bad, kid." Barron smirked, glancing sideways. "That's the best compliment I'm getting from you." Cole chuckled, nodding. "Probably." A moment of silence stretched between them, the city humming in the background. "Did I change your mind?" Barron finally asked. Cole exhaled, considering his answer. "You made me think, and that's more than most people do." Barron nodded. That was enough. As Cole disappeared into the crowd, Barron turned toward the waiting car. He had said what he needed to say. But this was just the beginning. By the next morning, the interview had taken on a life of its own. Clips of Barron Trump's words flooded social media. Some praised his composure, his ability to turn the conversation on its head. Others dissected his every sentence, searching for hidden meanings, for something to criticize. But one thing was undeniable: people were talking. At a small coffee shop in downtown Manhattan, a group of college students sat huddled around a phone, replaying his responses. "I never really thought about struggle like that," one of them admitted. "It's not just about money, is it?" Across the country, in a newsroom, a journalist drafted an opinion piece. The Barron Trump interview, a new perspective on privilege. It was a question no one had expected to ask. Even Ethan Cole, sitting alone in his office, found himself rewatching parts of the interview. He had gone in expecting to expose a sheltered rich kid. Instead, he had left with questions of his own. Had he been too quick to judge? Meanwhile, Barron himself remained silent. No follow-up posts, no responses to the media frenzy. He had said what he needed to say. And now, he let the world decide what to make of it. As he walked through the halls of his family's estate that evening, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You proved something last night. Don't let them define you." Barron stared at the screen for a moment, then typed a simple response. "I won't." Do you think one conversation can create real change? Or do people hear only what they want to believe? Share your thoughts in the comments. Days passed, but the conversation didn't fade. The Barron Trump interview had become more than just a viral moment. It had sparked debate, forced people to reconsider their assumptions. Some saw him as a symbol of change, proof that identity isn't dictated by legacy. Others remained skeptical, unwilling to see beyond the name. But no matter the opinion, one thing was clear. Barron had stepped out of the shadow of expectation and into a space of his own making. Sitting by the window of his private study, he scrolled through endless reactions, news articles, commentary, opinion pieces. Some praised, some criticized, but he wasn't looking for validation. He had spoken his truth. That was enough. His phone vibrated again. Another message, this time from a familiar number. "You did more than just talk. You made people listen." Barron exhaled, a faint smirk crossing his lips. He typed back. "Then I did something right." Outside, the city pulsed with its usual energy. The world kept moving. Debates continued. Opinions shifted. But for the first time in a long time, Barron Trump wasn't just a name people whispered about. He was a voice they couldn't ignore. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on more iconic stories.